Well, welcome to another Science Research and Society meeting. Today, we are incredibly honored to have Bernie Petit with us from the Canadian Light Source to share her experience and her knowledge in creating meaningful engagement with creating space within organizations for meaningful Indigenous engagement, equity, diversity, inclusion in science, but really just so many topics that we are going to touch upon. So I'm going to hand it off to Bernie to start us off, and just thank you again for your time and coming to share your knowledge and experiences with us.
Awesome. Thank you for inviting me. This is just awesome. So I am going to share my screen. I have a PowerPoint presentation to help guide this. And at the end, there'll be some information about how to connect with me. If you have any more questions, or if I make a mistake or misspeak and you want me to clarify anything that I've said, just get in touch with me. So the first thing that we always do is our land acknowledgement, and the Canadian Light Source is located in Saskatoon at the U of S campus, which is on Treaty 6 land and the traditional territories of the Nehiyawak, Anishinaabe, Lakota, Dakota, Nakota nations in the homeland of the Michif, or also known as Métis people. I also include a little map of where Treaty 6 is. I am broadcasting from the community where my children are from, and that's Beardy's and Okomasis First Nation. And I am in the little town of Duck Lake, which is also a traditional Métis settlement within Treaty 6. So that's where I'm broadcasting from today. We are still on remote working. I'm going to introduce myself in our traditional way. And so I am Wabana Benisiekwe, Nitsikasun, and Waiver Sikapo Nitochin. I also want to explain where any of the traditional knowledge that I carry comes from. And so I always introduce my peer review committee. So this is how the traditional knowledge that I carry is gifted to me. And these are the individuals that, like a peer review committee, they're the ones that tell me what to share, where to share it, and how to share it. And they also do a little double check just to make sure that what I do share is as accurate as can be with what was shared with me. So on the left is my mother and her sisters from Waiver Sikapo. So that is where my Anishinaabe teachings come from. On the right is my dad, which is Northern Cree from Opaskwayak Cree Nation. And then I also spend a lot of time with my adopted family from Carry the Kettle. Miss Cora Thompson is my adopted mother. And so that is my limitation. That's my waiver, that whatever I talk about is based on those teachings that were given to me, and it doesn't represent all Indigenous people or all Indigenous community. So this is our Canada's only synchrotron that's located at the U of S. So this is a particle accelerator. It's approximately the size of a football field. It's held in a building that at night is lit up and is a blue in color. So if you're out walking around, you may notice that building. And so we have researchers that come from all over the world that bring different samples to learn and have those samples teach them all kinds of new things. So we take light, essentially, we create the brightest light in Canada. And we also have light that is not visible to the eye. So essentially what a synchrotron does is like a flashlight. So if you have a flashlight on a mouse, our human eyes are going to be very limited to what we can see, just the external parts of that mouse. And with the lights that we have at Canadian Light Source, we have energies that are in the X-ray, we have infrared, we have crystallography. So we can see all the way down to the proteins, the little viruses, the little cells, and an atomic level. So that's what we can see using the bright light within the synchrotron rings. So it's a really cool toy that we get to play with, or I get to play with anyway, with students. So I am a pandemic baby to Canadian Light Source. Essentially, I started just as the pandemic hit us. So I haven't actually worked in the building, and I haven't had students other than virtual students working with me. So it's going to be such a change in my world to be going back into the physical world. But I have had a lot of opportunities so far to share how to influence and change the world of science. And that's kind of where we're at in our world at this time. And so I always use, because my background, I came from working as a director of health, a director of operations in First Nations. I am kind of trained that I always use the consultations. And so for me, the truth and reconciliation call to actions that is a bona fide legacy that our traditional knowledge keepers, our elders have left us. And these are some good starting places of how to make that change. And so that's what I use as my foundation when I'm working in an organization like Canadian Light Source to get things started and to put that foundation down for some change. And most of our TRC calls to action, in my opinion, starts a lot with the educators and the teachers that you meet along the way. And so we have a lot of power of influence that we can change what we do. So before I get too far into some of the science, I do want to acknowledge a trigger warning. Science typically has been done at Indigenous populations and not with. And so there are some things that have happened in the past that can be triggers, and things that I talk about that are not sometimes always comfortable. And so if at any point you feel like this presentation triggered you, please stay with me at the end and I'll make sure that we get some support for you. Now, here's an example of how to implement some of those truth and reconciliations into the science that you're going to be doing in your lifetime. So 63 is one, and a lot of the calls to action, if you're not familiar with them, they do have like sub guiding principles underneath of them as well. So it's not just one, but this is an example of how I have the ability to influence the world of science so that I can bring information to what was the impact of residential school on science. And so this is an example of some impacts of the residential school. So I created this timeline. So this is a timeline of chemistry. So in 1831, when Justice von Liebig, I'm terrible at pronouncing some of the European names, and if I slaughter them, I slaughter them. But essentially what Justice did is he is the one that set up how chemistry was going to be taught in classrooms. He is the foundation of how all chemistry is done. But when that was happening in the world, it was also when our first residential school started to open up. And as we see with the science of like the cell theory being formulated in 1831, that was the time where Indigenous people were being removed from the land and taken from their homes. The periodic table, when it was developed in 1869, was the time where the land was no more occupied or allowed to freely travel throughout the land any longer. And in the 1876 was when the very first development of what substances are in chemistry was created. And that was also the same time that within our Treaty 6 territory, that the signing of the treaty was at Fort Carlton. And so then I just kind of fast forward to 100 years of modern science. And it's also 100 years of residential school. And this can be done with each branch of science. So this is a biology one, because in 1831, that is when the cell nucleus was being discovered, or DNA in 1869. So there is also the meiosis that was in 1876. I wasn't this old, so I can't verify all these things, but they're on Wikipedia. And I know that you have to like pretty much verify most of the information on Wikipedia. So I'm trusting that these years are pretty close. And again, looking at physics, here's another way of looking at physics. And, you know, electromagnetic induction, which the synchrotron uses all the time, is at the same time that the residential school started. So looking at science from timelines like this is important a teaching tool for many reasons. One is we always hear, or I always hear the words modern science. This is modern science. But yet there's a calibration of time where sometimes the world wants us to think that residential school was so far in the past, but it's modern science, it's modern, it's modern colonialism as well. These are all at the same timeline. It also demonstrates that the Indigenous perspective was never included, never built. The foundation never involved the Indigenous people who were at this time trying to survive, right? So what does it look like now? Is now that we're in 2022, we're in this whole new world. And for me, I live in very exciting times because now it is acceptable to say, like, now we get to have a new world of discovery. We get to build trust and reconciliation together. And there is a lot more openness and space to do that within science. So that's a way of an example of how you can still teach about residential schools, but in a science context, so that we don't lose the guiding principles that our traditional knowledge keepers and our elders included in the TRC. So another example for call to action number 62 is, how does language connect to science? How does culture, how does traditional knowledge connect to science? And again, these are Bernie's versions of things, okay? I'm not a researcher, I'm not a scientist, I'm actually a mental health therapist. So, but these are the things that I see in the world of science. And now that I'm working with the traditional knowledge portions of this mainstream science. So this is an example. This is not the teaching in its entirety or whole. This is just an idea just to show that for Nehios, a 4-part person, is that we have a balance between these 4 sections of ourselves. That's typically how our life goal is to create balance within ourselves, balance within our communities, balance within our larger world. But in the world of STEM, and in particular science and math, and this is just my experience of going to my very first chemistry and physics classes, is that I found that the mental and the spiritual parts are very underdeveloped. And then I was left with this really strong emotional and physical responses that are overdeveloped in STEM. And so what I think has happened, and again, it's just my opinion, is that I think that during the time of this modern science, when they were trying to separate state from church, or remove religion from logic thinking, is that they removed Indigenous science principles inadvertently, because I think that they thought that our stories and those creation stories, those things were a religion. But I don't think that what those individuals realized at the time is that is how we as an oral tradition carry science. And so those are some of the things that we're going to look at. And also just not seeing any of this science relating to my world or my family dynamics or anything. It just became, I felt very overwhelmed and I wanted to quit, or I would turn off my camera and silently cry to myself as the physics was rolling by. And some days, not gonna lie, I could have turned to violence. Like I did want to throw punch people a couple of times, but that's just some humor in there. But some people, they'll either freeze, they'll want to quit, or if it's in class and in person, you'll see some of those individuals in high schools and in grade schools, they'll throw a book, they'll topple their desk over when they get really frustrated in the science and math. And this is a reality for Indigenous students in many of those science and math classes. So what's missing out of STEM is that culture and that identity. And so I always use that, I call it the empowerment principle. Every cookum, every auntie will tell you, never forget where you come from, no matter where you go. And so essentially that's what I just started to integrate, was the things that I knew, and I know my family, I know what I was taught. That's all I can do in my lifetime. And so for you individuals that are getting started and you're going to university and you're just getting into this world of science, I hope that some of the things I can share with you today inspire you to bring yourself, and never forget where you come from when you're working with science. And science is an education of exchange. That's what I find. And so for Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous science, these things are typically held within our traditional healers, our medicine people, our plant nation, like our gatherers of plants. They were so smart in chemistry, states of matter. They knew when a plant was to be taken as a whole, as a root, when it was supposed to be a smudge, as a gas. They knew when it should be a liquid or in tea form. You know, they knew, and they had these understanding of states of matter, plants, weather, all those things prior to this modern day science or this mainstream science. It's just, it was never included in there. So you as individuals have this ability to influence and work together with science in whatever form. Either you're doing the science, you're teaching the science, you're living and breathing the science, essentially. And so these are some examples that I just include as to where you can find some of those Indigenous science principles. And like our traditional hunters are some of the most original land science out there, environmental science. They have so many teachings that they carry and they pass on to their generations. And then some of our traditional societies, and like our midwife, you know, before doctors were, all those midwives, they had these amazing teachings. And I've had the opportunity in my lifetime to talk to some retired midwives. And so their teachings about life and the cells of life and where life begins is just, it's amazing, but it's something that has never been included in the textbooks or the teachings of doctors or obstetrics. So it's really important to know that we are all related. We need to work together, and through teaching or influencing. I'm not a scientist. I cannot contribute much to science, but I'm going to, in my lifetime, try to influence the crap out of it. So that's my life goal. So again, this is some science principles that where Indigenous knowledge brings value into this science that's already there. It brings some missing parts to the science that's already there. But like I said, my teaching is an Oja Cree kind of background. This doesn't, you know, this is a totally different version if I was from West Coast, East Coast, Northern in our communities. So this is just this region's version. So creator's law, it's sometimes in our communities it's called blood knowledge or collective knowledge. In outside worlds, they call it traditional knowledge. These are teachings that are passed on to us that you cannot Google. You can't get them in that form. You only get them by living and loving your culture and being immersed into it. And it's an oral tradition. And so those are things that we get to bring to this science. We also get to bring our oral education system. So if you're an Indigenous person, I like to make blanket statements because I'm not a scientist, but I don't know, I'm sure somebody could do the research on it, but we are matriarchal. And so this is a 2-second version of that. But many of our families, we have a kokom, a grandmother that oversees all of these individuals in her fledgling group. And within that is how our oral traditions are passed along. And then we interact with ceremonies or community events, and that's where we get the community matriarchs or disciplinarians in there. So there's strict roles for males and the females in there, but essentially it's an unspoken way of how we communicate with each other. And from the time that we are born, our kokoms recognize within us if we're a matriarch in training, if we are a two-spirit, if we are backwards children. There are ways and teachings that they guide us, and they make sure that in their lifetime, they pass all of those things to us. That is if everything works well and we're not surviving, right? We have the Awansak, that's kind of like how I was, because I was, from the time I was 2 weeks old, taken into foster care until I aged out. So an Awansak means like lost. I was outside of the group, but we have traditional ceremonies like making a relative ceremony. We have traditional ways of bringing those ones back into our world. And that's essentially where we are globally, is that we know we had kids in foster care and 60 Scoop and all of those that even may have had to hide their identity just to stay alive are now coming back into the family. And so this is where we see in this bigger picture that there's going to be all these new teachings to add to science, right? And for those that come from that oral tradition, the mainstream education, you're balancing two different education systems. So whether you know it or not, your way you're growing up, the way your kokum teaches you, the way your aunties teach you is very different than when you go to university. So you're learning two different ways of learning all at the same time. Sometimes there's going to be clashes, you know, and if you ever feel like you want to give up, you want to leave, it's not for you, you know, chances are you're experiencing a culture clash. It's not a cognitive obstacle. It's more of a culture class to get through. And so that's really important to recognize, that you have these two education systems working inside of you at all times. So some of the Indigenous science principles that, like I said, I've learned, that's what I put into the programs that I do. And I try to influence the world of science to open space for, is one is Ateo Kikwen. These are our sacred stories. These are our creation stories. This is where I find a lot of our science is held in these stories. And some of those, I'll give you an example. So I work on a Bison project, and it's coming to the time of year where we're going to start to see these flowers again. So these are crocuses. They are the very first of our medicines that come out in early spring. It's like a clock. It tells us when it's time to start picking medicine. And, but there's teachings that come with these crocuses. So the name that they're called, the descriptive, actually describes bison belly buttons. And so our elders tell us, when we see these in the spring, you can see how large, how many bison covered the plains in the past. So it's a reminder of like how big those bison herds. But this is also in mainstream science, what you would call botany and zoology, the study of plants, the study of animals, right? This is science, but we don't think of it as science because we just know them as traditional teachings or parts of that we're going, like our sacred stories. So again, this is not the full teaching, and there are elders that can share the entire teaching, but there is one of the white buffalo calf woman, or how the men were gifted with the pipe. A woman gifted the men with this pipe is how the story was told. And when that gifting happened, there was also information shared that a white buffalo was going to come at a certain time frame after this gifting. And so that it was going to mark a change in our world. Okay, so that's the teaching that's been passed down for many generations. But when you look at it from a science perspective, like this is mind-blowing to me. So what our ancestors were telling them is that there's going to be bison albinism. They knew that before the textbooks about albinism were written, right? This is something that is carried on. This was also the birth of bison ecology, right? So our relationship with the bison just got deeper. So it wasn't that it was just like the bison were the Walmart where we were using them for clothing and food and all the other supplies. Now we were going to be connected to these bison for this time frame to know that there was going to be a change in the world, right? So what was the change going to be? There's some descriptors of what the change is going to be. But again, that's part of a teaching that you would have to be a part of. Another Indigenous principle is our language. So I have a whole theory of language. And when you start to spend time with language keepers, which I am not fluent. I only know Matskri. I only know what I'm trying to teach my grandchildren and my children. But when you get to spend time with fluent speakers, I recommend it. And start to look at the language deeper than just trying to take it into your heart, is learn the descriptors. If you can, learn the syllabics, because they're tied to the stars, they're tied to star knowledge, which is older than, again, time immemorial, older than this modern mainstream science. It's also like an equation. That's how I see it. It's like an equation. So we have E equals MC squared as a math equation on our side. But when you start to get into quantum mechanics and the Dirac equation, as well as just what equations are in math, then I started to see, oh my gosh, this is what language is. It puts together, there are certain phonetics within the Cree language that describe everything that's put together. And that's what an equation is. So for us not to have connections to science or math, I see it as we have had a disruption in the language, and that's where our math is. That's where our language or our science is connected to, is in the language and the syllabics. But one day I hope that there's going to be a whole group of language speakers and I get to like run this by them and we get to nerd out on math and language. Until then, I can only talk about it. But if you have the opportunity in your lifetime, math and science goes with language, and it would be a lifetime of work, I'm sure, and just good for the heart. Another Indigenous science principle that I apply to our projects, as well as working with other nations across the world, is this idea of Wakotuin. In some language, or in Sioux language, Matakweasin, Guagano Maganak, I'm still trying to practice the pronunciation of the words, how we're all related, all my relations. We are related to everything. That's the teaching. So we don't silo science. We don't silo those kinds of things. We are related to the stars, and the stars are related to us. You know, the plants, the soil, they are us and we are them. Same with people. And I had a really interesting question one time when I did a presentation from a non-Indigenous American. And she said, I always hear that Indigenous people say, like, we have to heal this wound that has happened in our world. We have to heal this wound. Is it a wound? Does it? And this is what I say, is how I was taught is that within Indigenous science principle is that we even have in our ceremonies making of a relative. And we're told that we have a brother and a sister from each nation. And for us to be balanced is to learn and meet those individuals. And so when we have such a disruption between non-Indigenous and ourselves, it is a wound. We're missing part of our world's understanding. That's why we have to reconcile. That's why it hurts us so much. So that's how it was told to me. And that's where I see, like, we're just related to everything. And so in science, I try not to silo the projects that we do in the same way that they may have been done in the past. Other is traditional cultural expressions. So on the left is an example. This is my late mom's Gashki Dibigan, or it could be called a bandolier bag. These are what some people see as works of art. And yes, they are beautiful. However, they're actually, what they are visual cues to an oral tradition. And so on the left with my mom's bag, like, she spent time with us before she left and went home. is to go through her bag and her story, and each bead, each color, each image is a visual cue to parts of her story for us to remember. And so it's no different for me that I see like a science poster, right? You're telling everything that you experienced, what you learned, all of those things. This could be a different version of a science poster. On the right-hand side, the wood carvings, those are maps. Those are from Inuk regions of maps. Paper is going to do you no good in the tundra. So, but when you need to travel, you need to find your fishing spot, you need to, go there. These are beautiful wood carvings, but they're also maps from time immemorial, before topography and all of those other kinds of sciences were created. And it's to remind them of how to get somewhere. And the same with the other pictures, is that those are traditional cultural expressions for us to remind us of the stories that we're supposed to share and tell what we learned. So now trying to put those into a synchrotron and all of the glorious things that a particle accelerator does. So I have 3 programs that we have developed in the education system over there. And so they're typically land-based. They integrate regional. So I open that space so regionally that any classroom, elders, traditional knowledge keepers can incorporate their teachings, their science in there. I don't go and impose an Ojakri type of science. I don't go in impose a mainstream. So really we open it up, we plan it out, and we learn to fill the basket with all of these understandings and foundations. And it's pretty freaking awesome. In my lifetime, this has been the most exciting adventure I've been on. So we do have the Pascuamustas. It is the Bison project. We go through the project and we look at the Bison wasn't, it's just amazing some of the things that you learn along the way, but the Bison, we all lived together. We were all together, the birds, the bugs, the bears, the bison, the people, we all surrounded that bison herd. And so when you get to read some of those old literature review accounts of it, it just blows my mind as to everybody was there. Everybody was there. And also it was those bison hunts was the same thing that happens in modern time, is where this is where all the science of agriculture, genetic science, pharmaceuticals, and innovation sharing always happened, was around those bison herds. And I don't have a lot of time to go into it today, but from there, a lot happened. And now we have this new modern day relationship with bison. And so our chiefs and our traditional knowledge carriers have started to sign on in participate in the Medicine Line Buffalo Treaty. So that's restoring buffalo herds, and you'll hear of different First Nations, different Indigenous communities that are no longer following the herd, and they're now becoming the herd managers. And so this again is an evolution of our tradition and cultures. We do not stagnate. Our cultures and our traditions always evolve. And so with that, I always ask the students is, so who are you going to allow to do the science and research of how to restore the bison? These are animals, a whole community that's connected to us. You know, who are you going to allow to do the research? Because you're in science now, so I'm going to encourage you all to go into bison science. But, you know, there's so many different areas of bison and understanding the bison that have never had an Indigenous perspective there. And so there are people that can have careers and be close to the bison in a different way again. And I would love nothing better than to do a literature review and find Indigenous scientists are the ones writing the articles about the bison. I think that would be an awesome thing to experience. So the Pascua Mustas project looks at the bioaccumulation of supplemental feed versus free grazing bison. Not all of our communities have large enough grazing areas, and the grazing areas have been changed through settlement, that the bison don't have the foods that they normally would have out free grazing. So that's what our project looks at, and we collect hair and soil samples. We work with the bison, we work with the traditional knowledge keepers to look at traditional uses of soil. And so this is an example of one of our medicines that I go out and gather annually. It's like a blue-gray clay. This is what it looks like dried. On the right-hand side is my elder teachers. That's their version. Of course, I got to get fancy and try to put it through a straw so it looks like all slick and fancy. And I did a presentation in Ontario, and somebody had shared this picture that the country where they're from, they actually have similar teachings in their Indigenous community about soil and being part of traditional medicine practices. So we bring those into the science. And this is just an example of that blue-gray clay is once we started running that through the synchrotron in our beamline called ideas that we use for education, I was just like, I just love how my cookum knew that all the vitamins, all the minerals that were in that dirt for our health prior to ever being in a synchrotron, prior to having textbooks or other spectroscopies. You know, they knew that. They had that relationship with that soil. And the other thing is our traditional medicines and our plants. This is a whole area of science, again, that is very near and dear to our traditional teachings, our culture. And on the other side of things, learning a new foundation, I had an elder share with me that it was the bison that showed us what medicines to pick. And it just like blew my mind as, oh my gosh, what are the bison eating? You know, are they self-medicating? Is that how we learned how traditional plants in some of those areas were? Just is exciting stuff. And I hope this motivates somebody to look into those things, research these. This is just some cookum Bernie that's just throwing it out there. So these ideas have never been really chased down. And there's so many up and coming young, smart scientists that there's lots of work to do. Another area of research that I always incorporate in there is the bison her story. So when I was sent home at the pandemic to try and do a literature review, which I didn't really know much about, I only knew from my own experience. And being a director of operations, I had the opportunity to read through a lot of old Indian agent journals that were in band office basements, different articles that were kept, historical articles. I got to spend a lot of times with elders and that would teach me, you know, some of the history and the family connections and how things were. So that's all I knew. And when I started to read some of the foundational academic articles about bison and who saved the bison from extinction and the history of it, I realized that it was a history. It was only written about the men. Some things to me, I started to question like timelines of how things were working, and it didn't make sense to me. And so I started to look at just the things that I knew. Back to the basics, matriarchal family structure. Okay, who were these men's moms? Who were their wives? Who were their sisters? And then from there, I started to chase down, and I found these amazing stories of the women that were actually momentous in saving the bison from extinction. But I had to go about it in a backwards sort of way because, you know, you had to prove before I can say Margaret Mackay helped save the bison. The bison that we now know from Elk Island Park, Alberta, were saved by Margaret Mackay, or Mackay, depending on where you're from, the pronunciation. And her mom had a momentous impact on that we have bison today. And so you have to prove it in a different way. But what it showed me is there's a lifetime of research just going through all the research that's been done and putting a different perspective into that foundation. So a lot of the foundations of things that don't have that Indigenous perspective. So you don't always have to do, a modern kind of project. You can always go back to the historical projects if that's something that is in your heart. So another example of creating space in science and research projects, when I started to work with the periodic table of elements, and again, I don't have a science background, so this was all new to me, but it was really hard to connect to what this is. And I'm from that oral tradition, so I'm not used to memorizing things where it falls out of my brain 10 minutes after I wrote the test. Like, I like things to stay in my heart. And so I started to go down like, what was our relationship with the elements before these squares arrived in North America? Right? So how did Indigenous people connect to the elements that were in our regions? And I threw that out there into the universe, and NSERC, a federal science organization, helped me to put together a science literacy work project where now it's becoming a project. And so I have a dream team, as I like to call them, and they are traditional knowledge keepers as well as individuals, Indigenous people within science today. And we are coming together and trying to create a resource for teachers to use that can be in the region of what were the relationships to the periodic table before these squares got here. And so this is an example of berries and bivalves. Hereditary Chief Anne Mack and her daughter Brittany Morgan participated in the project, and there they are. They're so adorable. They're from the Nuchella Toquat Nation out west. And this was an example of two very important food sources that they use in their world, mussels and clams. But they also recognize that these were very high in iron. So in their region, this is how they interacted with the element of iron, was through this clam. And this is a much more meaningful way of teaching the relationships and the stories of, then our students take those periodic table of elements and that understanding into their heart and not just memorizing it in their brain. And so this is a project that's ongoing. We are, and we're looking at our periodic table in that it does build the same kind of relationships. And another interesting fact is Dmitry Mendeleev in 1869 was this guy that created the periodic table of elements. And he had a dream about it. And that's how he knew to put it in these little squares. And so everyone follows that one. Now, if a traditional knowledge keeper went in and said, I had this dream, and this is how we're supposed to look at the relationship of iron, it's not viewed in the same way. It's not written in every textbook, right? So we have to look at those things as, we have to be accepting of that knowledge both ways equally. And so this is an example of how the water from the ocean meets fresh water. The salmon come in at that time. The bears are connected to the salmon. The bears actually feed the trees certain parts of the salmon. The bees and the bugs carry the pollen that's on those parts. The birds help with pollination. And this shows a relationship between the salmon and the salmon berries, right? And then as we go along, there's a time in the year where the bear stops eating the salmon, starts eating the berries, and then we start eating the berries and the salmon. And so this is, and then you'll see at the bottom there, and there's a nice, beautiful little prego belly. Our matriarchs always knew what to feed our women when they were pregnant to ensure that their babies were healthy and the vitamins that come in there. And again, once I start sticking them in this synchrotron, and then it's like, wow, that's so amazing. They're so smart. They knew so much science, and they didn't have anywhere to write it down. They just knew, and they carried these practices on. So this is an example from the West Coast. This project is going to look at those kinds of things from all different regions and create a template so that other organizations, other teachers can fill it in for their area. Looking at the science model, you know, like again, these are all things that were done based on a different foundation. But an elder that taught me this was an Indigenous science model is that we already have a theory that the Creator is going to provide for us. And they provide us with the heat, water, fire, like the things that we need to eat and cook. And these are the things that we call facts. And it mirrors that other way of science where you go and you learn your English, math, science, history. Those are your facts, and then you develop a theory. So it's not that it's entirely different, it just mirrors each other. Like if you folded that paper in half, they're similar, but it's just a different understanding, a different perspective. And this is another example from the Silent Genome Project. One of my role models is Dr. Nadine Caron. She is our first Indigenous surgeon. And she is, and her projects of the Silent Genome Project are looking at that science method and doing things different. And we have learned from the past of having science done to Indigenous communities and not with them. And so these are examples of how those scientific methods can be altered, can be changed, and it doesn't change the validity of the science. It makes for a stronger science, in my opinion. I also try to incorporate that there's more than one way to be a scientist. Yes, there's a mainstream education way of becoming a scientist, but within our Indigenous communities, we have a clear path of how you become an Indigenous scientist and how those traditional knowledge principles are passed along to you in their entirety, right? The more that you involve yourself with that traditional path, the more those Indigenous science principles are given to you in their entirety and not just brief lessons or general lessons. And again, for all of you guys, if you guys feel anytime that you are doubting yourself in science, find yourself science role models. There's so many awesome men and women that have done some amazing things that, like I said, Dr. Florence Glanfield is one of my faves because she is like a math whiz. And so anytime I feel like, oh my God, I don't even want to look at these numbers and letters together again, I just remember, okay, Dr. Florence can do this, I can do this too. And yeah, so I have my favorites in there, like I said, and you find who your favorites are and keep them with you. Let them inspire you, keep going as you go along. Other ways to influence science, since you guys are all up and coming, like I said, our science is everywhere. But our textbooks are not written in that way. And so our students, again, have a hard time seeing themselves in the science when you go through the science textbooks. So I always include this in my talk because I never know who's going to become a curriculum writer, who's going to become a textbook writer in your future. So definitely there are all kinds of Indigenous science, just from what I've learned, which is nothing. There's so much more out there that could be included. And for sure, once we start getting into the quantum physics, like I just start, again, nerding out, because this is where a lot of my family teachings were very similar. And I just like, oh my God, this is stuff I know and understand that my kokum taught me. And so I love this kind of science. And if I got to live my life over, I think I would have been a physicist, now that I have kind of touched upon it. So yeah, I just wanted to share a little bit with you. Hopefully that motivates you, keep going. I know some days in science it can be disparaging, but you're so valued, you're so needed, and there's so many areas of work that get in there. Just get in there. Miigwech, Nanaskam, and Ekose, Marci. Those are the only ways that I know how to say thank you. And if anyone needs to follow up with me, correct me on anything, absolutely. You can use my, well, you can go on the website, use my email, send me an email anytime. And I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Bernie. I learned so much and very powerful and insightful. And I have a question. Can I ask it?
Yeah, absolutely.
You had that idea at the beginning about like relating to the world of science and not feeling like you related to it. And a big part of that, you talked about belonging in STEM and how like those two things are really connected. So what are ways that we can, or things that we can implement at the university level to help students then find that belonging? Because I think belonging, as you so beautifully like and eloquently put it, is so related to feeling like you can be a part of STEM and then contributing and continuing that journey, especially because I love the point of how you mentioned our journeys to becoming scientists look different and they don't have to look the same or be uniform. And in fact, that probably adds to more creative, innovative thinking. So how do we go about that, like the university level, maybe?
Yeah. Well, you know, like everything is in our world at this time is in transition. So nothing's ever going to be perfect. You can only start with where you guys are and creating the space that you can with the tools that you have. And I think that you guys are doing a really great job at doing that. One thing I always try to do as well is, you know, just connect with people. And I know the Canadian Light Source, myself, education, we always try to champion Indigenous students in STEM. And so if it feels like you don't have a cheerleading team, you don't have fans in the stands, you come and connect with us, you know, take a summertime job with us, be a tour guide of the CLS, do anything that you can, get to know as many scientists as you can, because some days, especially on those hard days where you feel like giving up, you need to have those fans in the stands that'll cheer you on and say, no, don't give up, keep going. You're an amazing problem solver. And that's one thing that we're all very good at. And so that's what science is being able to solve the problems. And sometimes you just need a little encouragement. So find yourself a good science champion wherever, if it's in the science department, if it's in a science research area, just don't try to do things alone. That's my key. And same with the university, is a university and a class or a person alone is never going to do it. That's not our way. We all join together and work together. So I hope that helps.
Yes, it does. There's so much food for thought. And I'm really grateful that you came and joined us today, Bernie. And I'm going to take these things and just, I think, reflect and sit on them is the best way to think about them to start with.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you for inviting me. That's awesome.
Yes.